Under the school, the hall that didn't want me. By the time the district trusted me with a key ring heavy enough to bruise a hip, I'd learned to prefer buildings after bedtime. No bells, no lockers slamming like cymbals, no teachers asking for miracles from a mop. On paper I was a custodian, in practice I was the last heartbeat. In a body that forgot it had one after dark. Cedar pine middle had been poured in the 50s and expanded in awkward bursts, hallways that didn't line up. Stairwells that argued with codes, a basement that ran like a vein beneath the old wing and stopped short under the new. When I hired on, an older porter named Alvarez told me to leave the lower level alone unless a work order forced my hand. He grinned when he said it. But the grin had years in it. I laughed, then discovered the smell under those stairs, a cold, wet cement breath that didn't belong to any season, and stopped laughing as often. The overheads down there were temperamental, half the time I took a flashlight because the fluorescents buzzed like hornets. Flickered, and gave up. The walls sweated when the boilers lost their temper. Storage rooms lined the corridor, one crammed with metal desks stacked like bad Tetris, one with boxes of textbooks that had failed to make math lovable, one with busted projectors staring blankly from sagging shelves. I could go weeks without needing anything from below. Then a note would be taped to my cart in Mrs. Parsons' precise handwriting. Folding chairs for morning assembly. I read it, looked at the time, looked at the door to the stairwell, and tried to invent a brave version of myself. The door was heavy and barely remembered hinges. It closed behind me with a bass drum thud that the building swallowed and digested slowly. My boots counted out 2 loud steps on the concrete flight. Down in the corridor, a switch flipped only 2 strips of light, the rest stayed gray as unpolished stone. The flashlight beam gave the dust something to pretend to be. The chairs lived in the second room on the left. Its handle creaked the way knuckles do when weather changes. Inside, polish and old timber had married into one smell, the kind that makes you think of assembly halls and mothers with pursed lips. Stacks leaned at odd angles like tired men in a bus station. I braced a stack with my knee, lifted 4, and froze. Somewhere out in the corridor something scraped, an unhurried slide, a shoe sole that hadn't decided whether to pick its foot up. The sound ended cleanly, as if edited. I waited long enough to hear my own blood, then told myself a dozen reasonable lies. Pipes shift, metal pops, gravity has opinions. I carried the first load to the stair base and set them there, pretending the plan was to shuttle like a beetle. The air changed, colder, sharper. Like a freezer door had opened 3 feet from my face. The basement never breathed like that. There were no windows, no vents that made wind. I raised the light and found only hallway and my imagination. Back in the chair room, the stacks looked wrong, like a photograph slightly out of order. I tried to remember whether the short pile had leaned that far. It didn't matter, I said. It mattered anyway. On my second trip out, I heard a dull thump followed by a faint scrape farther down the hall, toward the little classroom no one used since the new science wing. The door to that room was supposed to be shut. It stared at me now with a narrow eye of darkness where the latch should have met the strike. My stomach fell. The way it does on an elevator that stops between floors. I told myself air pressure tricks doors when other doors move. I told myself humidity swells hinges. I told myself to stop telling myself things and go upstairs. Instead, I set the chairs down, put both hands on the flashlight, and walked toward the crack as if it could hear me. My voice surprised me in that corridor. Thin and not good at pretending toughness. Maintenance, I said. If someone's down here, say so. Nobody did. I bumped the door with 2 fingers and then, ashamed of the 2 fingers, pushed it open properly. My light swept shelves furred with dust, stacked boxes with faded labels, obsolete glass beakers. A rolled periodic table that had forgotten where to curl. No footprints. No wet marks. No reason. I stood in the doorway listening to the school decide what it wanted to sound like. The dragging came again, behind me this time, out in the corridor. Not a skitter. Not an animal. A human weight shuffle with patience where a stride should be. I pivoted too fast for the beam to keep up. It sliced the hall in a bright white lane. Nothing moved in that lane, but the edges swam with a sensation more than a sight. Every hair along my forearms tried to make decisions on its own. I backed away, step by step, until the stairwell mouth found me. Chairs under one arm. Flashlight hand shaking, I climbed without counting. Only after I locked the heavy door at the top, a rule I normally scolded others for breaking, did I let myself breathe in a way my lungs recognized. I told myself a better story upstairs. Thermals. Settling. Vermin with ambitious shoes. I almost believed it. A week later, mopping the corridor directly above the stairwell, I heard 3 strikes from below, not random bangs, not pipes, but measured blows that wanted to be heard. They boomed through the plaster like a fist against hollow wood. The mop slid out of my grip and thumped to the tile. The stairwell door shuddered as if something had put its shoulder to it from the other side. I stood there until the trembling stopped, then propped a maintenance sign in front of the door like yellow plastic could argue with whatever lived past it. After that I quit doing brave impressions. If a list demanded something from the basement, I waited until another set of keys jingled in the building. I didn't tell the others why. The older men had jokes, the young ones preferred facts that left the world tidy. I didn't have tidy to offer. What I had was the memory of air that turned to ice without permission and a door I'd seen open for no one, and the original sound of a slow foot being dragged across a concrete floor as if the floor and the foot were deciding together what distance meant. Basement air has layers the way a pond has temperatures. A foot above the floor it stays metallic and wet, copper on the tongue. As if coins had dissolved into the concrete long ago. Higher up it grows chalky, plaster dust and old paint, the school's skin flaking into the weather inside its body. When the fluorescents stammer, the dark isn't merely absence, it feels active, full of small decisions. I caught myself whispering roll calls to prove the world was present, shelves, boxes, labels, the plastic bin with broken rulers. The line of taped floor where someone once measured out a badminton court and forgot to peel it up. The more I named, the quieter the corridor became. Like a room that resents being catalogued. There is a noise old buildings make that lives between creak and sigh, cedar pine spoke it when the boilers drowsed. It carried through the cinder block. Like a rumor trying out different shoes. I learned to distinguish that from the deliberate drag I heard that night. Weight makes grammar. The scrape behind me didn't trip or hurry, it pronounced itself, consonant by consonant, a sentence written with a heel. My light found only damp. On the painted block, an uneven sheen that mirrored the beam back at me in a thin ribbon. My own face in the shine looked like a man listening to someone else where his name. Carrying chairs became a ritual to contain the nerves. For at a time, arms out, fingers pinched through cold metal, I counted stair treads. Under my breath, matching breath to step so the body wouldn't invent a sprint. At the landing I always paused, not from weight but from etiquette. As if asking permission to pass. The school has rules even after the teachers go home, close the door softly, don't run, don't shout, don't feed. What wants to be fed? I obeyed all but the one about not looking back. I looked. It never rewarded me. I tried a test later on, left the chairroom door wide while I went for the second stack, to see whether the corridor felt different. When the room stared openly into it. It did, colder by a few notches, and quieter in a way that deadens the edge of hearing. Somewhere a drop of water traveled a pipe and announced itself at elbows, somewhere a small fan inside a forgotten AV cart turned once in its sleep. But at knee height, where a child's reach would live, the air pressed close, as if someone's bedtime had arrived. And they were resisting the story's end. Those 3 measured booms that came a week later redefined the stairwell for me. After them, the door wasn't a fire break. It was a mouth with a patient jaw. I started storing mops on a different peg so I wouldn't have to stand with my back to that mouth. When I reached, I rerouted my trash runs to keep an extra wall to my right. None of that made the place safer. It did make me feel like a man who could still negotiate with a building, which is sometimes the only safety left. 2, 3rd floor, box in the wrong place. My next custodial gig was a high school named after a local politician nobody remembered while he was alive. 4 floors, 2 gyms. A schedule that made my legs forgive me and then hate me in cycles. On overnights we usually worked in pairs, sweeping out days and resetting the world. So morning could pretend it was new. The 3rd level always felt lonelier than the others. It held classrooms with paint older than students. A corridor of lockers that sighed to themselves, and rooms the principal called temporarily retired, which is a bureaucratic way of saying, we keep the ghosts and the extra desks in here. On the night that overwrote all the others, the second man on my shift called off sick. I told myself that meant more radio music and fewer arguments about procedure. I started at the bottom, bins, wipe-downs, sinks that believed in performing. Light bled in slow waves along the old fluorescent rows, flickering as if the electricity had to be convinced to travel. By midnight I had worked my way up through the quiet and the easy and into the floor that was neither. The 3rd floor hallway could make a person doubt their stride. The acoustics stretched boot heels into something unnatural. I was halfway through a long pass with the mop, when I noticed a classroom door ajar 20 feet ahead. It was one I knew well, a heavy wood slab with a square wired glass window, and I knew I had locked it earlier. That certainly rose in me like nausea. I parked the mop, adjusted the grip on my flashlight, and approached because pretending not to see is a luxury you don't get. With a master key on your belt. Inside, desks stacked like barricades, boxes along the walls, the smell of paper that has learned too much humidity. Nothing meaningful had moved, at a glance. Then the corner of my eye caught the wrongness. A box at the back had been dragged a half foot out of alignment. Its scuff traced a pale arc on the floor. I crouched and touched the mark as if I could talk sense into it. Tired, I told myself. You missed that earlier. I pulled the door shut, properly, and returned to the choreography of mop and bucket. The corridor felt like a throat after that, and I was mop, swallow, letting the routine do what routines do for fear. When I circled back toward the stairs, the door stood wide. My ribs tightened. I shone the beam in, no hesitation this time, no pretense, and found the box repositioned in the center of the room like a dog called to heel. Who's in here? I asked, keeping my tone managerial and failing. My voice ricocheted off tile and glass and returned to me thinner. No answer. For a second I almost laughed, because laughter sometimes keeps your knees from making strange decisions. From the rear of the dark classroom came the sound of breathing. Not the building's lungs, those are mechanical and impersonal. This was the thick, careful draw of someone trying not to be heard while needing you to know they were there. I don't know how long I stared at the place the sound fit. I don't know why I didn't flip on the overheads. I don't know why my hands remembered the sequence of slamming a door and running before the rest of me voted. The corridor received me like a tunnel. I made it to the stairwell. Pressed my back to the cool metal, and counted to 30 with my eyes closed because numbers don't lie, even when I do. Calling the supervisor felt like welding common sense to panic. He promised to come. 20 minutes turned into a geography lesson where every second was a county I had to cross. When he arrived, bigger flashlight, calmer lungs, we returned together. The box still sat in its new throne. We looked in closets, under tabletops, behind cabinets. He lifted a fallen poster with 2 fingers like a magician revealing the absence of a rabbit. Nobody, he said, the way practical men say mercy when they won't name it. You're overworked. I nodded because arguing would put my voice back in that room, and I wasn't sure it wanted to go. The rest of the shift dragged like a bad song. Every locker door suggested a jump I tried not to take. Shadows inched the way shadows do when lights age. Weeks later, over coffee, a coworker told me about a kid who once hid overnight on that floor to pull a prank and scared a teacher into quitting. He smiled, as if handing me an explanation. Neatly gift-wrapped would settle my ledger. Maybe it should have. It didn't cancel the breathing I had heard. It didn't explain how a locked door chose to be open, twice. At a time of night when keys live only on my belt. I avoided that hallway unless the job refused to exist without it. When I did go, I quickened every task, shortened every pass, counted every step. The sensation of being watched did not always appear, but when it did, it arrived with the confidence of something that had paid rent. I learned the art of not looking into rooms with my name in them. And I kept the mop head very, very busy. Third-floor nights had their own weather. Heat rose by habit and then got lost, pooling in odd corners like thoughts you meant to finish. The corridor taught me which tiles complained and which tolerated footsteps with grace. When I worked alone, I let the radio stay off. So I could hear the building choose its noises. Tape banners left from homecoming lifted a millimeter then settled, like fish tasting current. The exit signs cast a red that could have passed for warmth if you didn't stand under it too long. That dragged box, only half a foot off its dust mark, bothered me because it was a small offense. Big wrongs are theater, little ones are policy. Whoever, whatever, moved it knew the room's quiet and adjusted within it, making change you could talk yourself out of believing. I slid the box back into its clean rectangle and felt a ridiculous relief, the way you feel when a picture frame is straightened. And your headache loosens by a strand. Breathing is the first sound we learn and the last we forget. The version I heard in that classroom reminded me of someone tucked behind a couch. During hide and seek, trying very hard to be air but leaving seams. It wasn't damp or wheezing or dramatic. It simply existed and required me to notice. The beam made a pale stripe across the back wall and painted the stacked desks into long-legged animals. I thought of saying a name aloud. Not to summon but to soothe, and decided names are expensive at that hour. Waiting for the supervisor in the stairwell, I counted details instead of seconds, scrapes on the landing rail, the nick in the second baluster. A smear of blue paint that didn't match any sanctioned color in the building. The counting worked until I tried to listen for footsteps that were not my own. It's strange how much hope there is in wanting ordinary feet to come down a hall. I promised myself that when he arrived, I would describe the breathing without apologizing. I nearly kept that promise. Afterward, the corridor stopped trusting me. That's the best I can say for the change. Where I had once been invisible to it, the way staff are invisible to every school until they need something fixed, I felt regarded. I started propping doors with wedges even when I didn't plan to be long. I started wearing softer soles so the hallway would not notice my approach. I left a spare flashlight in the janitor's closet on that floor. So I'd have an excuse to leave faster. Forgotten tools make exits simple. 3. The auditorium that would not be empty. Every school has a room that feels bigger after dark. At Alder Ridge High, that room was the auditorium, 3 tiers of seating that climbed like terraces. A stage deep enough for secrets, curtains heavy as winter coats, ropes and pulleys that gave the ceiling the look of a ship turned inside out. During the day it was announcements. Pep rallies, tragic comedy, laughter that didn't echo right. At night it became a cavity in the building's chest, and if you stood alone on the main aisle you could imagine the place. Remembering every voice it had ever held. I saved it for last when I could. One winter night I didn't get that choice. The drama teacher had left a note about a morning rehearsal and the place needed to be done early. I rolled my cart in through the side door and the hinges sang a flat, theatrical note that ran out into the space and then back at me. The door swung shut behind me and clapped. Like an audience that didn't approve. I started with the aisles, candy wrappers, dropped programs, pennies flattened by boredom. The broom made a sound that turned on itself and came back larger. From the stage came a rustle that wasn't mine. A prop settling, I thought, and kept sweeping. Then another, the rhythm of someone walking across the boards as if testing them, slow and deliberate. I set the broom against a seat and went up the stairs to the wings, flashlight ready to explain the world to me. Behind the curtain, ropes hung with sandbags, flats leaned like old scenery waiting for their turn to pretend to be something better than wood. The light made dust perform as if paid. No person. No raccoon sneaking tenure. I stepped down again, telling myself what everybody tells themselves in old theaters: acoustics play games, buildings exhale, your name is not on the playbill. I finished the lower tier and moved to mopping. The water had that chemical tang that promises cleanliness at the price of a new smell. Between passes, a shape slid along the second level where you'd expect a latecomer to hurry, except there was no hurry in it, only a relocation, a dark smudge using the architecture as an excuse to exist. I lifted the beam and found row upon row of seats presenting only their bolted patience. It took a while for my heart to learn slow again. It never learned right. Some sounds are easy to excuse. Whispers are not. They rose from the balcony above like two people deep in conspiracy who'd forgotten they weren't alone. No words I could parcel out, only the music of speech. Hearing your name in that music violates something you didn't know you'd promised yourself. It said my name with a teacher's care, syllable by syllable, close enough to make me turn like a student who'd been caught drawing. Nothing waited where I looked. The curtains hung exactly as heavy. The ropes swayed exactly not at all. I climbed the stage steps because work remains work even when your head wants air. From that height the rows looked like a crop planted in neat expectation. My light combed the upper tiers. A silhouette sat where the best seats are, just for a breath, just long enough for my eyes to make a decision and regret it. Then it was only a pattern of dark fabric and armrests pretending to be a person. I dusted, rearranged a chair that had migrated to a dangerous spot, and gave the stage a clean strip of mop water so the morning could have its sheen. Behind me the whispers thickened. And the back of my neck learned a cold that did not belong to January. The first step toward the side door felt like breaking a rule nobody had told me. The second felt like a rule finally keeping me. Out in the corridor, the night air pushed its shoulder into my face. Sharp with frost, unperfumed, and relief arrived like an apology for the hour. Behind me, high above, the faint percussion of feet continued for a few beats and then remembered they had other things to do. I locked the door with hands that didn't want to be watched and leaned on the jamb until my breath sounded like mine again. The next day, over a trash run, someone mentioned a story the school carried the way old churches carry candles, a director who had dropped mid-rehearsal years back, heart giving way on the stage in front of students. The teller kept his tone light, respecting the living more than the dead. I nodded, not because I believed in ghosts, the word is too greedy, but because I believed in rooms that don't empty just because we've left them. I stopped taking the auditorium alone after that. When I had no choice, I did the work fast and spoke aloud about ordinary things: water, paper towels, a stain on seat F12, anything to give the space a script where I was extra. Never lead. If my name happened to slide out of the dark like a correction, I pretended I hadn't heard and let the mop keep time for both of us. I kept thinking about those chairs days after. Little details stuck, the way polish had a taste, the way the cold arrived with intention. The exact width of that cracked classroom door. People imagine fear like a shout, mine was administrative. Clipboard still had lines to fill. Batteries still had to be replaced and an exit sign that insisted on quitting. The building made noises and I itemized them. Somewhere below. Water moved through pipes old enough to have learned manners. A locker coughed 3 halls away. A poster peeled at one corner, enough to whisper. Fear never asked me to run. It asked me to notice. On my last week at Cedar Pine, I found a child's mitten in the lost and found bin and carried it downstairs by accident while hunting for a replacement. Mop head. At the top of the basement steps I stopped. I don't know why. I left the mitten on the landing like tribute and fetched the mop from upstairs instead. The next night the mitten was gone. I didn't ask the others about it. Their answers would have been neat. Mine wasn't. I learned the shapes of my reflection in the third-floor windows because the lights inside would catch the glass and hand me a stranger to evaluate. Sometimes the stranger looked like he had slept. Sometimes he looked like a man whose job was to carry night around without dropping it. When I passed the classroom after that, I kept my eyes on the glass so I could watch the room through the reflection and not turn my head. It's a trick carpenters teach: use a mirror to see around what you shouldn't lean past. The box never moved again when I watched it that way. Which taught me something I still don't have words for. Paper has a particular sound when a draft finds it, a faint flit, not a rustle. That night the only paper that flitted was on the bulletin. Outside the offending room. A geometry quiz key wagged once in the motionless air. I tore it down, not because it was messy, but because I didn't want the hallway to offer the room anything that sounded like an answer key. After Alder Ridge, I started noticing stages in places that weren't theaters, the lip of a loading dock, the steps up to a church altar. The part of the grocery floor under the loudspeakers. Any elevation teaches attention. I found myself avoiding the exact center of big rooms. As if a trapdoor might practice remembering. I read somewhere that whispers carry farther in domed spaces. Our auditorium ceiling wasn't domed. But the acoustics had a talent for handing your own words back to you with a different opinion attached. I learned to let silence be the only sound. It still didn't feel like mine. When the janitorial closet door in the wing off stage left stuck, I sanded the swelling paint and greased the latch because that is what you do. For doors that need to behave. I caught myself saying, "Thank you," when it shut without protest. Gratitude toward mechanisms isn't superstition. It's partnership. The building carries you, you carry it back. When the auditorium is a machine built for multiplying small sounds into larger ones. A wristwatch becomes a metronome. A cough becomes an event. When I swept popcorn from between the seats, each kernel skipping across tile sounded like a stage direction. The place taught me to move slower than usual. Quick motions echoed and embarrassed themselves. Under the seats, where gum becomes fossils, the mop head hissed and dragged in a kind of stage whisper, rehearsing lines I never learned. From the stage, the ocean of chairs arranged itself into suggestion. Faces where there were none, a posture implied by armrests. I kept my beam low because lifting it to the balcony felt like inviting distance to respond. Once I stopped under the light booth and listened to the air cycle through the ventilation grates overhead, warm on one side, cool on the other, as if the building breathed with two mismatched lungs. The whispering from the upper rows braided with that circulation until I couldn't tell which thread was language and which was air deciding to pretend. When your own name rose out of that braid, it didn't arrive like a shout, it arrived like attendance called gently in homeroom. First and last, a tone that says this is not punishment, this is ritual. I had a teacher once who said your name is a leash and a blessing, depending on who holds it. In that moment I refused to be led and tried to accept being blessed. Neither felt honest. The cold at the nape of my neck that night was not draft. Drafts come from somewhere. This came from decision, an element choosing me. It didn't bite, it insisted. I finished the mopping because work is an alibi. I rolled the bucket carefully so its wheels didn't telegraph panic. At the door the crash bar felt both too heavy and too light, the way objects do when you've been paying attention to the wrong weight. Outside, breath smoked in front of me as if someone else had exhaled through my mouth. After I heard about the director whose heart had stopped midline, I touched the edge of the stage before every shift, a superstition I invented. And never admitted. Not a caress, not a prayer, just contact, skin to varnish, a pact between roles. I promised to leave the room better than I found it. The room promised nothing back, which was kindness. Demands would have made me believe. Backstage smelled of rope, paint, and a sweetness left by fog machines years after their last cue. The sandbags wore their knots like old medals. I would sometimes stand in the wing and watch the curtain breathe, just the faintest inhale when the HVAC shifted, like an animal sleeping. It was easier to accept that than to imagine a person on the other side. Acceptance isn't belief, it's a work uniform. Seat numbers in white enamel marched along the rows like little commandments. I read them when I got nervous, counting by twos. Then by odds, then backward, until the arithmetic steadied the mind. At 13 and at 47 the paint had chipped to bare metal. Those became my anchors, 2 points in a sea to swim toward when whispers tried to draft me into their choir. In some lights the lacquer on the stage showed a paler rectangle where another platform had once stood, a ghost of wood. I avoided stepping there. Superstition, yes, but also respect for whatever choreography the room remembered. The mop left a darker pass across that patch, and it pleased me to see new shine where the old outline refused to fade. When I finally pushed the crash bar, the door's hydraulics hissed a syllable that could have been, go. Outside, the parking lot lights made islands on the asphalt. Between them the dark felt thicker, but honest. I stood in one island and let the night examine me back. The auditorium behind the wall kept its counsel. The first time I stood center stage on purpose, I spoke the alphabet under my breath to give the room a voice I could afford. Each letter went up and did its bow and left. By Z, my hands had stopped trying to shake. The empty seats kept their promises, they saw, they didn't judge. Really scary stories, every day. Subscribe, like if you like, turn on the bell so you don't miss new videos.